Hello, I'm Rachel from Echidna Sewing, and today I'm going to show you how to make two simple patchwork blocks like this. Patchwork is a type of sewing taking patches or pieces of fabric and stitching them together to create a design. You can have an all-over design, and you can have designs or elements within a design, so you can have squares and triangles. Then they're all stitched together to create a quilt top, which is laid into a sandwich to create a quilt, like this. Quilt top, batting and backing. Today we'll make two types of blocks. A simple 9-patch block using squares, and then we'll make a block called churn dash that introduces you to cutting and stitching squares, rectangles and half square triangles. To make the blocks, all you need is, you'll need some fabric, you'll need a wool pressing mat and an iron. I use some heaven sent starch for ironing my fabric. I'm using a 1/4 inch foot today. I've changed my needle to a universal 1280. I have some coarse spun poly thread that I'm using that matches, a close match to my fabric. I'm using 3 different rulers, so the long ruler, a 6.5 inch ruler and a 5 by 5 inch ruler. I have my cutting mat, which works in association with my rotary cutter. Of course, I've got my machine, and today I'm using the Brother M370 because it has scissors. I love doing patchwork with scissors. So let me clear the table and let's get started cutting. Okay, so the first step in preparing to cut fabric for your patchwork block is to iron it. So I am a real stickler with ironing, and I always use a spray starch, and that is because I get a crisper finish. The reason I'm a stickler with ironing is, one, it makes the fabric nicer to look at and to cut, but also when you're working with your fabric, it's easier to handle. So when you're using spray starch, and I'm using heaven sent, the idea is that you spray the fabric and then you leave it, probably, I would leave it for about 30 seconds to a minute, depending on what I'm doing, if I'm shuffling things around, and then I iron it. Now that allows the starch to soak into the fibre of the fabric, and that usually gets rid of all the wrinkles. So that looks pretty well ironed and done to me. I'm just using a steady heat. It's not really hot. I have 100% cotton, and there is some debate about whether you wash or don't wash your fabrics. We're not going to get into that today, but pressing does matter. I think that is my point. So the first block I'm going to cut is this 9-patch. And you can see that there are 3 different colours. So I have 1, 2, 3. So the centre is the dark green, and then I have 4 4 light green and 4 medium green. So the first thing I'm going to cut is my centre square. Now my 9-patch square measures 12.5 inches, and each square measures 4.5 inches, which is the size I need to cut. So that's why I have my 5-inch patchwork square. So I'm going to use this square, and I'm going to start with my 1 and 1 in the top right hand corner, and I'm going to cut 1 square that's 4.5 inches. Now what I'm looking at here is whether this lines up cleanly, and it's a nice cut line on the 4.5, and it looks like it is to me. So I'm looking at this mark, that's my half, this mark is my half, and that corner, if I pull that down, you can probably see that's my half as well. So the ruler makes it easy for me to cut my first square. So then hand on the ruler, and I go up. So I'm going past the ruler and across. Then I'm going to turn it round, because you can see that these edges are slightly fluffy, and I will take my ruler again, and I've got my 1 1-inch marks in here, and And I know that these are perfectly clean edges because I have just cut them. And I'm just going to tidy up the fluff on each side here. You can see there's a little bit there. Probably a tiny bit. Oops, the ruler moved slightly. So that's one square. That's going to go there. The next step is to cut my 4 medium greens. So to do that, I'm using a slightly large piece of fabric, so I'm going to use my longer ruler. And you will find that I do use alternate between long and smaller rulers, and that's because it's just easier to cut longer lengths with different rulers. So for this one, I know that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and here's my half mark here. And I'm going to cut a 4.5 inch strip because I need 4 squares. So it's easier for me to do this. So there's one 4.5 inch strip, and I'm going to probably only going to get 3 out of there. 1, 2, maybe 2. So I'll cut a second 4.5 inch strip. I don't waste these. I pop them aside and put them in a bag to create something later, so I don't worry about small offcuts. And then I'm going to go back to this ruler and I'm going to cut these down to 4.5, keeping, I should be able to get 1. I'm going to turn this one around and cut off the small furry pieces on the side there as well, keeping that 4.5 inch aligned. So that's 1. Okay, so the last one to cut is the pale green, and I'll follow the same process. 2 strips at 4.5. This is why it's good to have a variety of rulers. They are different tasks that you use them for. And sometimes if I'm not comfortable and I thought that this edge was a little crooked, I did move the fabric along, the ruler along a bit, so I had some fabric to cut off on that side. Okay, so the 9 patch block is cut. The next patchwork block we're going to cut is churn dash. So just so you can see, this block is different. So this would be a absolute beginners. If you're starting out in patchwork, it's a really good place to start to stitch, to get comfortable with your stitching. This one introduces you to rectangles, half square triangles, and of course there's a square here as well. So while I'm on the cutting roll, I shall continue on and cut out churn dash. I'm going to cut out the pale grey blue first, and the first thing I need is a 4.5 inch square. And that's for my centre. The next thing I'm going to cut is my half square triangles. Now this principle is a little bit different. So the half square triangles actually need 2 5 inch squares, which sounds counterintuitive, I know, But what I'm going to do is it'll become obvious once we start drawing and stitching. So what I'm going to do is actually cut across here like this to give me my 5-inch strip, and then I'm going to go along here. Tiny little bit at the top just to neaten that up. Turn it round, and the ruler that I'm using is 5 inches, so I didn't have to check anything. So that's one 5-inch square, and this will be my second 5-inch square. And as I'm right-handed, you'll notice that I twist the fabric. I pick it up and move it around because that's easier for me. Obviously, if you're left-handed, you would do it the other way, but that's the way that I've done it. So that's 2. I'm actually just going to pop those onto that corner there because these 2 are going to make up 4 half-square triangles for this block. The last thing that we need to cut are 4 rectangles of 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. So I'm going to use my long ruler, and I'm going to cut 2.5-inch strips. Move that off so I don't cut it. So using this ruler, that's 1, 2.5. Keeping the half mark on the straight edge. I might come in a bit, so I'll just trim it off, and I'll need 2 of these strips. So go 1. So I'm turning it around so my cutting edge is always to the right of the ruler, which works in conjunction with this rotary cutter. So that's 1 strip. I'll do 1 more. Oh, that was perfect placement. Now I'm going to do what we call sub-cutting. So I've cut my strips, now I'm going to sub-cut it to 4.5, and I'll need 4 of these. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, the last thing to cut is the churn dash. So that was our background. This is actually the churn dash. So I need 2 5-inch squares to make my half square triangles, and I need 1 strip of 2.5 by 4.5-inch pieces. So I'm thinking I might actually just cut that strip here. I'm going to neaten up this edge so you can see, and I'll probably cut this as a 3-inch strip, and then I'll cut it down to 2.5, and that way it gives me 2 clean edges to work with, and I'm aligning my ruler with the fabric so that's straight, not with the mat. So this is my 2.5-inch strip. Turn it around. So using the edge I've just cut, I'll put my half mark on this clean edge, cut this down, and I shall cut my 4.5-inch by 2.5-inch strips off here, removing the selvage. And I think this corner is slightly out, just a fraction, but it will make a difference in the piecing. That was right, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, let's do the 2 5-inch squares. That's not going to be big enough. That will be, but I think I'll just cut it down here just to make it easy for you and for me. So let's find that ruler, placing it on the fabric, and it's going to go cutting off the selvage here. Turn this round, and I can now square up this corner. I think it's moved slightly, so I'll just go in a fraction. I'll go 1, 2, 2 5-inch squares, which pair with these guys. Okay, that's all the cutting we need to do for both blocks. So for our 9 patch and our turn dash, I'm going to clear off the table, grab my machine, and we'll start stitching the 9 patch. Okay, so I'm ready to start sewing. The first thing that I always do if I'm stitching blocks is I lay out the pieces of fabric to the right, usually on my wall pressing mat, so I know the order in which I'm going to stitch. So this is row 1, this is row 2, and this is row 3. But I will place these together and stitch, press, sew, press, etc. Show you that in a minute. In the meantime, here I have certain things that I do with my machine. One is I always change my stitch length down, and that is because it's a shorter, stronger seam. So I would go into my machine settings, and let's say it was on 3, I would change it down to 2. Some patchwork quilters use 1.8, but sometimes if you have to unpick, it's really hard. So I go for 2. The other thing I always check with my 1/4-inch foot, which I already have put on, is that my needle is in center needle position, and it will actually rotate or go down into the hole, and I'm not going to break my foot. So those are my machine settings. As I said in the beginning, if you can, buy a machine that has thread trimmers or cutters, because it makes it really easy when you're doing patchwork just to be able to stitch and cut. Okay, so I'm going to grab my first pair of squares. I will put the edges together. There's no need to lock or reverse at the beginning of each seam that you stitch. Just start on the fabric with your threads to the back, and that's because all the seams will become enclosed in the quilt top, so we just need to just align. And you can see that I am using the patchwork, the 1/4-inch foot here, and putting my fabric and nesting it right into that guide. And that's how your 1/4-inch foot works. You keep your seam flush and drive straight down. I'm going to cut, and that one seam done. I will grab my next one, and I'm going to actually press both seams once this one is stitched. So again, right sides together, starting on the fabric. I shall make sure my edges are flush, and I'm just going to stitch. Then, when I'm ironing, I just move these up so that the seam doesn't show on this side, we actually press the seam to the darker fabric, or the dark side is what I often refer it to in some circumstances. I'm going to go this way, and as I'm doing this, there's a slight amount of tension on my square. So what I've done is I've set the seam, and then I'm going to the right side. I'm just going to press my whole row to make sure that the seam is flat and flush. 1 row down, 3 to go. Put that up there. Grab my next pair. And I'm just going to keep on stitching now. Okay, so I've stitched all 3 rows together. Now I will press. So this one, I'll press the seams out, and luckily the dark fabric here is in the centre, so I'm just going to press the seams in. We call this opposing the seams. And this one again, I'll press them out. A little bit of tension on that to create a flat seam on the side. Just here, just setting those seams. 1, and setting these ones in. Now, I have never been a user of pins, but if you're new to patchwork piecing, you might like to use them. So the next step, this is row 1, row 2, row 3. Now we're going to attach row 1 to row 2, and these seams get nested together. So that is what I'm talking about here, is this seam gets nested into that seam. And if you're not comfortable with it actually just sewing, you can put 2 pins here and here to hold it in place. And let me show you how you would do that. So you would place 1 pin here just to hold it, and you'll place 1 pin here. Then we go to the machine. Again, this edge is flush, so all my squares match up because the cutting is accurate, and then stitch along. All the way, slow down as I'm getting towards the pin, and then I'll go as close as I can, remove the pin, and then keep stitching. And do the same thing once I get to this pin. So I'm going to take it out now. I'm just going to do an adjustment. I adjusted the fabric because it wasn't quite lined at the top. So do that. Stitch it all the way to the end. Cut. And these should be aligned. I will sew the next piece on before I iron again, and I'll use the same principles. I shall put the seams nested together here, place my pin to hold it in the right spot, and that seam nested together here. both at the top, and stitch. That's all the stitching done for this block. You just need to press, and what I'm doing when I'm looking at the back is I'm making sure that none of my seams are twisted, you know what, and this one is. I've caught it. So I'm actually just going to unpick it by snipping here, which will just release the stitches. And I'm going to sew along here so that I know that those seams are opposed and flat. So I'll just quickly do that. So nesting and opposing the seams enables the fabric to sit flat in your quilt, and that's why we choose to do both of those types of sewing techniques. So I'm going to iron that and iron these two flat because that's what we'd originally done. Now I'm going to press this one up and press this one down. And I'm still kind of tugging on the fabric to create that tension so that when I go to this side, there's nothing caught in the folds of the fabric, so it presses completely flat. And here's our very first 9-patch block completed. Cut, stitched, pressed. Pressing does matter. So this one uses half square triangles, rectangles, and a square. So we're combining a few elements here today for this block, and that's what it looks like. So we can't lay it out yet because we haven't created our triangle. So that's the first thing. I know that we've got our centre square, which is there. We've got all our rectangles, but when creating half square triangles, I have chosen a 5-inch square because we're going to create it, the half square triangles, using this 5-inch square by drawing a line through the centre from corner to here, here to here, which is actually our cutting line. It's not a stitching line, it's a cutting line. And then we're going to stitch 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Now the reason I've used the 6.5 inch ruler is it gives me a flush edge here for me to be able to draw my pencil line, which, as I said before, is my cutting line. All will be revealed shortly, so I'm going to do that to 2 squares. So both the squares, and this will reveal my half square triangles. Okay, the next step is I'm going to actually change my foot to a regular sewing foot because I kind of want to see where I'm driving on each side, and I'm going to use this foot. I'm going to change my thread as well so it matches. I'm going to change my thread colour. I've changed my foot, and I'm going to use the edge of my standard foot on the pencil line. So that is going to be my guide because the pencil line is my cut line. I want to stitch 1/8 of an inch from that edge. So what I'm going to do is my line, and you can see my needles here, and it's about, it's probably 3/8 of an inch. What I want it to do is I need to move my needle position, so I'm going to move it to here on my foot. So I'm going to go into here and using my zigzag would move it over to here, which is about 1/8 of an inch from this pencil line, and I'm going to sew. I've still got my 2mm stitch length. I've got this edge of my foot on this pencil line, and I'm going to sew down each side a straight line to create my triangles. All the way to the end. I'm going to flip this round. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, so using my presser foot. Really, the edge of the pencil line, and sew straight down. And I'm going to grab my other piece, and I'm going to repeat that process. Okay, so I have stitched both 5-inch squares into triangle pieces. Now I just have to cut them apart. This is where the magic happens. So you go, oh, that's why you do it like that. So the pencil line, as I said, is the cutting line. So I'm just going to cut through here. So you can see that's 1 half square triangle, 2 half square triangles, and this will be 3, 4. So I'll get rid of that, and use my scissors because I missed a thread here. You can see I have 2 half square triangles. And in case you haven't realised, they're called half square triangles because they're half of a square. I didn't name these things, it's just the way it is with patchwork, so I just turn that up a little. And these little things at the end here are called dog's ears, and you usually trim them off. But we need our half square triangles to be 4.5 inches, right? Because that's what our centre is going to be. And so I know that this is about 4 5/8 inches, so I'll have to trim them up. But I'm going to press them all first, and pressing them to the darker fabric, not the lighter fabric, so it doesn't show through. I have to say I really love this new Aliso iron. So it's actually really light. I can probably just push it with my palm. But it's weighted really well. It's so easy to use. Okay, I'm going to grab my mini mat back so I can show you. I'm going to use this ruler because it does give me this marking through the centre. And so here's your 4.5 inch mark here, 4.5 here. So I'm going to pull the ruler down a little. So I'm going to create enough fabric on each side to create a clean trim, and also nipping off my dog's ears. Sorry if that upsets you, but they're not real dog's ears. So I turn it round and put the 4.5 mark on the clean edge. So 4.5. almost up the top. And we'll repeat for the other 3 squares. That's one. Okay, so those are my half square triangles trimmed to 4.5 inches. So like we did with the 9 patch, I'm going to lay out the block here so I can piece it together in rows. So my first row for churn dash is background, my 2 half square triangles. That's part of the design, goes here. The second row has that colour in the centre. The lighter colour is the background. This is the design. This one goes here and here. And so, when you're working with rectangles and triangles, you have to piece the elements together first. So we've pieced the half square triangles. Now we will piece these to make a square measuring 4.5 by 4.5. So I'll do that. Change my foot back. I also have to readjust my needle position to centre, and my stitch length stays at 2. So I shall piece all my rectangles together to make a square. We're actually going to do something else, introduce you to a new term called chain piecing. So chain piecing is usually when you're just sewing block after block after block, which is what we are, and it just nests into the next one. And of course you've got to make sure your edges are flush. Pop it down and stitch away. It's usually faster than cutting and going over and grabbing the next piece. So I'll do this, and I'll end up with 4 pieces chained together with my stitching. Chain piecing is usually done when you are stitching together similar blocks. So we're stitching together 2 sets of rectangles to make a square, and we've got them laid out beside us so we know where they're positioned, so there's no chance that we're going to put the block together incorrectly. So then just snip them apart, go back, put them where they belong. And the next step is, you guessed it, more pressing. So again, to the dark piece of fabric. Okay, next step is to join this to that and that to that, row 1. This to that to that, row 2. Repeat. Let me start stitching. Okay, so those are the 3 rows stitched together. Now I'm going to iron. This one's going to be out. Iron these rows. Actually, I might push this one in. I might go against the principle here. One. These ones can go out. 2. Out, so this one's pressed in. So I'm trying to make sure that my seams are opposed. I do that first with my ironing so I don't have to do any adjustments once I've stitched them together. Okay, so let me grab 2 of these pins. Like we did with the 9 patch, it's the same. Oppose the seams here. 1 pin here. Oppose the seams there. Stitch along. And that last one, and then we'll have both of our blocks completed. So again, place those 2 pins into position to nest those seams together. Make sure that they're sitting flat. And stitch. Last seam stitched. Just need to give it a good press, and we have our second block completed. Okay, so churn dashes stitched and our second block is completed. I'm going to give you 3 top tips that I use all the time with my patchwork piecing. One is I always press my fabrics with spray starch before anything else. I make sure that my pressing is perfect and my fabric's looking good because it makes it easier to cut and to sew. 2, I am always using my 1/4 inch foot for accuracy of seams because of course it's so important in patchwork to have a 1/4 inch seam or an accurate seam. And 3 is a variety of patchwork rulers. You can see today that I used a long ruler, a small square ruler, and the ruler with the markings across the middle so that I could accurately cut my half square triangles. Those are the tools that I love to use every day in my patchwork. I hope you enjoy making some patchwork squares, and I look forward to seeing you soon.